An interesting thing had happened. This was in the spring of 1960. A psychologist by the name of Lloyd Homme came to town in the spring with the idea of setting up a teaching machine and program learning company. This is a brand new idea. The ideas of teaching machines or program materials, which the basic principle was small steps, immediate feedback, and design instructional materials had just begun to be talked about in various organizations. And they just received some money to set it up. Lloyd came and visited us in the psychology department, and at that time I had been appointed as the research assistant in the experimental lab. My mentor was Henry Ellis. Henry Ellis was interested in verbal learning and human learning kinds of activities, and that became my interest too. In fact, I became a very good researcher in the field of human learning, and even had an article published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology a year later. So I was interested in what Lloyd was talking about, but there was no opportunity to do anything more than that. But after I was laid off from the engineering company that summer, I went to see Lloyd. They had now set up their company, and I talked to him about could I go to work for them. Actually, I had two offerings at that time. I could either go to work for Lloyd Homme in the areas of applied psychology, writing instructional materials and teaching machines, or I could go to work for a small engineering company nearby designing antennas. I look back now, and today's, of course, antennas are big things in space and so forth, but so is instructional design and basic applied psychology. Would I have been better off in the antenna design? I don't know. But I decided to go with Lloyd Homme. He decided to give me a chance and hired me for one project. Because of my knowledge of electricity, he said, why don't you produce a program course in basic electricity? Which I did. I wrote the course, and it was published and did quite well. In fact, it was eventually adopted by the U.S. Postal Service and later by the Indian Army. I got a letter of a recommendation from the head of the Indian Army on how well it was working. A few years later, I expanded it in another version of it and sold it to the United States Navy and the Great Lakes Training Center. So, in fact, that one little program that I developed had a lot of mileage. I did so well that Lloyd said, stay on, become a full-time employee, and I did. We had, in TMI, we had developed a relationship with Grolier, which was the Encyclopedia Americana company, and they decided they would distribute all our materials through their salespeople door to door. This was an enormously large market possibility. So we began to gear up and start producing programs. I then got into areas of basic arithmetic activities. The first program I did was how to tell time. Then I did addition, subtraction, multiplication and division, fractions, decimals, and percents, and eventually even co-authored, of course, in high school algebra. These did very, very well and sold many, many copies. Eventually, my arithmetic series was adopted by a number of remedial programs around the country funded under the Great Society that was started by President Johnson, and was eventually also adopted by the Job Corps to be used in all their centers. So my little efforts in producing that material ended up with hundreds of thousands of copies of my material being distributed throughout the states. It begot, unfortunately, I was not ever paid a royalty. I was paid $100 a week to write the stuff. And they made, Grolier particularly made millions off what I had done in those days. The program instruction was an interesting kind of thing. In those days, it was kind of like the dot-com business later, because there was so much hype about a new way of approaching education. It was written up in magazines, newspapers, on television, and everywhere. And suddenly, there was a huge amount of interest in the idea of producing teaching machines and program instruction, and a lot of money was suddenly being thrown into the field, which induced, of course, many college professors to give up their academic life and go in business. By 1963, there were estimated over 400 teaching machine program learning companies in the United States. A year later, most of them were out of business, just like the dot-com industry. It wasn't maintained. The TMI, however, was the biggest and best funded and most productive of all the organizations. We produced and sold more than all the other companies put together, by far. Our products were best, and we got into a number of areas beyond the academic areas. After about 2 years, the sales of the academic areas began to tail off a little bit because the encyclopedia salesmen had reached limits on what they could sell out there and things. And it wasn't being adopted in schools as much as they had before, so we decided to go to industry and the businesses. And we began to get contracts in with organizations to produce program instructional training materials for them. The real advantage of program instruction was that it was independent learning. You didn't need an instructor. It was all designed for people to study on their own. It was much more effective than the correspondence school kind of stuff. It was well designed and tested. And so we began to get contracts to produce that kind of material. I did several of them for small contracts, one on laundry development, one on American Management Association, but then we got the big one. IBM came to us and said, we want you to develop all our customer education material on all our machines. And I became the project director, my first big project, at the age of 26. And I had 25 people working for me. I said this was the age of the punch card, so what the machines we were teaching the customers to use were the key entry machines, the verifiers, the card sorters, the reproducing punches, the accounting machines that used the punch cards, and so on and so forth. We began also to do a little bit of work on the computers. They were just being introduced, business computers and computer languages were the early days. I had to look at a computer and I had to learn. In those days there were very seldom languages. I had to learn to program in machine language to do that kinds of zeros and ones. They were just doing the first assembly languages at that point. BASIC was just being developed at Dartmouth. Interesting little side note on that. My later business partner, Stephanie Jackson, happened to be going to Dartmouth at that time because it was near her place. Dartmouth was still an all-boys school, but she was a graduate student and they hired her to come in and do some work, and she could attend some classes. During that time, she also learned from Chemney how to do BASIC programming. She may well have been the first woman ever to learn BASIC in developing programs in that area. So the big project was IBM, and we began to work on it carefully and do many, many things with the IBM project. Spent many hours working on that to develop all the kinds of materials, and we tested it, and it was quite successful. But during that period of time, I said this was 1964, about that time, and what was happening was, although there was still quite an interest in the areas businesses, and the areas in business would continue, the academic stuff began to fall off, and TMI began to cut back. And at that point, Lloyd Homme and I decided to leave TMI and set up a nonprofit version called TMI Institute.